Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Gentle Mysteries. I'm Edward, and from the very bottom of my heart, I'm so glad you've settled in with us tonight. Whether you're curled up in a favourite armchair, tucked beneath a quilt with a cup of something warm, or perhaps listening from somewhere far across this wide, wide world, you are, as always, most wonderfully welcome here. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to ask you something, and do please leave your answer in the comments. It means a great deal to read every single one. Have you ever heard a clock strike and felt, just for a moment, that the time it announced couldn't possibly be right? That the world around you and the hands of the clock were quietly, politely, disagreeing? It's a curious sensation, isn't it? Tonight's mystery begins with precisely that feeling. Chapter 1. The Gathering of the Village Now. Let us make our way to the village of Steeple Markham, a place of mellow stone cottages, well-trimmed hedgerows, and a parish church of such handsome antiquity that visitors have been known to stand at the Lich gate simply to admire it. At its heart rises the clock tower of St. Mary the Virgin. 4 faces, each one gilded, each one, as the villagers will proudly tell you, entirely reliable. It has chimed the correct hour for 114 years without interruption. It was still chiming the correct hour, as far as Inspector Craddock of the Markham Constabulary was concerned, on the Tuesday morning in late October when Mr. Gerald Featherwick, churchwarden of 22 years and honorary treasurer of the Parish Restoration Fund, was found at the base of the tower's interior staircase, dead. The inspector, a well-meaning man with a tidy moustache and the unfortunate habit of forming conclusions before he had properly gathered facts, arrived at the church by 9 o'clock. He surveyed the scene, noted the narrow spiral staircase, the worn stone steps, the unlocked door at the foot, and the absence of any obvious struggle. He spoke to the verger, Mr. Toop, a thin, anxious man who smelled faintly of linseed oil, and had discovered the body at 7:30. He inspected Mr. Featherwick's overcoat, his walking stick, his leather-bound diary. He accepted a cup of tea from the vicar's housekeeper, and by 11 o'clock Inspector Craddock had reached his verdict with the comfortable speed of a man who dislikes loose ends. Accidental fall? The steps were worn. The man was 63. These things happen. No one disagreed. The village expressed its sorrow in the restrained, practical way of English villages. Covered dishes appeared on doorsteps. The church flowers were replaced with white chrysanthemums, and the bell was tolled at dusk for 3 evenings running. No one disagreed, that is, except for one small white-haired lady who had arrived in Steeple Markham only 4 days earlier, at the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Lavinia Croft, for what was to have been a restorative fortnight of country air and gentle walks. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the churchyard that October morning, her grey wool coat buttoned to the collar, a knitting bag over one arm, and looked up at the 4 gilded faces of the clock tower. She was not looking at the time. She was looking at something rather smaller, something that Inspector Craddock had not noticed, had not thought to notice, and would have considered entirely beside the point if he had. A smear of dark ink on the stone lintel of the tower door. Fresh. No more than 2 days old, she estimated. The particular brownish-black of a dip-pen nib, or perhaps a stamping pad of the type used in the vestry to authenticate the parish records. Miss Marple tucked this small observation away with the neat, unhurried precision of a woman folding a handkerchief, and turned to accept the cup of tea that Mrs. Croft's housemaid had just brought out to her on a tray. "Terrible business," said the housemaid, whose name was Doris, and who had a way of lingering that suggested she had considerably more to say. "Yes," agreed Miss Marple pleasantly. "Did you know Mr. Featherwick well, Doris?" "Only to see, ma'am, though cook says he was in the vestry 3 times last week. Which isn't usual, is it? Not 3 times. "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, watching the clock tower. "It isn't usual at all." Above them, perfectly on the hour, the bells of St. Mary the Virgin began to chime. Miss Marple counted each one carefully, and then, quite quietly, quite privately, she frowned. Chapter 2. The Verger's Linseed Hands. The village of Steeple Markham possessed, as most English villages of its particular character do, a precise and largely unspoken social architecture. There were those who attended the 11 o'clock service, and those who attended the 8 o'clock, and the distinction, while never openly discussed, was understood by everyone to mean something. There were those who were invited to the vicarage for the Tuesday afternoon reading circle, and those who were merely nodded to warmly at the gate. There were those whose opinions on parish matters were solicited, and those whose opinions, however forcefully expressed at the vestry door, were thanked for and quietly set aside. Mr. Aubrey Toop, Verger of St. Mary the Virgin for the past 17 years, occupied a position in this architecture that was at once central and peculiarly invisible. He was present at nearly every significant event in the village's ecclesiastical life: weddings, funerals, harvest festivals, the annual Gift of Thanks collection, and yet he was, in the way of vergers everywhere, noticed chiefly when something was out of place: a candle unlighted, a kneeler missing, a door that ought to have been locked standing inconveniently open. He was the human equivalent of a well-maintained clock, remarked upon only when he failed to function correctly. Miss Marple had noticed him at once. She had noticed the linseed oil, certainly, that faintly medicinal woody smell that clung to him like a second coat, the inevitable consequence of years spent maintaining the church's aged oak pews and panelling. She had noticed the thinness of his wrists, the careful darning at his left cuff, the way his eyes moved to the tower door and away again whenever anyone mentioned Mr. Featherwick's name. She had noticed all of these things with the same quiet, cataloguing attention she brought to everything, and she had filed them alongside the inkstain and the 3 unusual vestry visits, and begun, in the private and rather pleasurable way of a woman assembling a particularly intricate piece of lacework, to consider how they might connect. The opportunity to speak with Mr. Toop presented itself on the Wednesday morning, when Miss Marple undertook what she described to Mrs. Croft as a small constitutional through the churchyard, a description that was accurate as far as it went, though it omitted the rather specific route she had planned, which took her directly past the vestry door at precisely the hour when Mr. Toop was known to be polishing the brass lectern. She found him there, as expected. The vestry was a low, stone-floored room that smelled of damp hymn-books, candle wax, and the linseed that followed Mr. Toop everywhere. It was a room of practical clutter, robes hanging in a wooden press, a shelf of parish registers bound in faded maroon, a small oak desk in the corner bearing an inkstand, a green-shaded lamp, and a locked cash box of the sort sold by ironmongers for the purpose of holding petty accounts. "Good morning, Mr. Toop," said Miss Marple from the doorway. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I was admiring the churchyard and I noticed the vestry door standing open. Such a handsome room." Mr. Toop looked up. He had the pale, waterish eyes of a man who spent a great deal of time indoors and worried a great deal in the small hours, and they moved to her face, assessed her, a harmless elderly visitor, clearly, and relaxed by perhaps 1/2 of 1 degree. "Good morning, ma'am. No disturbance at all." "Dreadful business about poor Mr. Featherwick," Miss Marple continued, stepping inside with the unhurried confidence of a woman entirely accustomed to vestries. "You discovered him, I understand. That must have been a very great shock." It was. The brass cloth moved steadily across the eagle's outstretched wing. 7:30 it was. I come in every morning at 7:30. Every morning, how very dedicated. And the tower door, was it open when you arrived? A pause. Fractional, controlled, but present. "Ajar," said Mr. Toop. "It's an old latch. It doesn't always catch." "Ah," said Miss Marple pleasantly. She had moved, with the drifting, unobtrusive mobility of the very old, to the shelf of parish registers. "These go back rather a long way, don't they? I do love a good parish register. My own village, St. Mary Mead, has records going back to 1642. Such a comfort, somehow, knowing that everything was written down." Mr. Toop said nothing. The brass cloth had stopped moving. "I notice," Miss Marple continued, tilting her head at the registers with the mild curiosity of a woman in a bookshop, "that this one, the Restoration Fund accounts, is it, has rather a fresh edge to it, as though it has been recently handled a great deal, or perhaps rebound." The pause this time was longer. "Mr. Featherwick was the treasurer," said Mr. Toop carefully. "He was reviewing the accounts for the annual meeting." "Of course, yes. The annual Gift of Thanks collection. Mrs. Croft mentioned it. A wonderful tradition." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "And the annual meeting? When is that to be held?" "Friday fortnight." "How fortunate," said Miss Marple, "that the accounts are so neatly in hand then. Mr. Featherwick must have been very thorough in his preparations." She said this with every appearance of sincerity, and Mr. Toop, who was not a subtle man, accepted it as such and returned to his lectern. But Miss Marple, as she made her unhurried way back out into the cool October air, was turning over in her mind a detail she had observed in the 3 seconds she had spent looking at the spine of the Restoration Fund accounts ledger. The binding was indeed fresh, brand new in fact, the stitching along the spine still white and unsoiled, the leather still carrying the faint chemical sharpness of a bookbinder's workshop. It was the binding of a book that had been rebound, very recently. But the volume next to it, the previous year's accounts, had a small, neat label on its spine, in a particular copper-plate hand that Miss Marple recognised without difficulty as Mr. Featherwick's own, from the condolence register she had signed in the church porch that morning. The current year's volume had no such label. It had, instead, on its inside cover, she had managed a glimpse of 3/4 of a second as it caught the lamplight, a single line of handwriting that was not Mr. Featherwick's copperplate at all. A different hand entirely, rounder, less certain, written in the brownish-black ink of a dip pen, the same brownish-black as the smear on the tower door lintel. Miss Marple walked back through the churchyard, past the yews and the leaning older stones, and paused for a moment at the Lich gate. She looked up, as she had done the morning before, at the 4 gilded faces of St. Mary the Virgin's clock tower. It was showing 14 minutes past 10. Her own watch, a small, reliable silver one, a gift from her nephew Raymond, showed 11 minutes past 10, 3 minutes fast, consistent with yesterday, consistent, she suspected, with the day before that. Someone, thought Miss Marple, with the quiet, saddened certainty of a woman who had seen a great deal of human nature and been surprised by very little of it, has been keeping this clock running fast, not carelessly, not accidentally, deliberately, and for a specific purpose. She settled her knitting bag more firmly over her arm and turned in the direction of Mrs. Croft's cottage, where, she was quite sure, the 11 o'clock tea would be on the table and the cinnamon biscuits fresh from the oven. There was a great deal to think about. She intended to think about it very carefully. Chapter 3. The Scarf by the Lich Gate. The cinnamon biscuits at Mrs. Croft's cottage were, as Miss Marple had anticipated, excellent. They were the thin, crisp variety, not the thick, doughy sort that some people mistakenly preferred, and they were arranged on a blue and white plate with the unself-conscious precision of a woman who had been setting out biscuits for 40 years and saw no reason to do it differently now. Mrs. Lavinia Croft was that particular kind of English countrywoman who expressed affection almost entirely through the medium of food, and who considered a well-filled tea table to be a form of moral statement. She was also, Miss Marple had established within the first 24 hours of her visit, an exceptionally reliable source of village intelligence. Not gossip. Mrs. Croft would have been quietly offended by the word. It was simply that she had lived in Steeple Markham for 51 years, had known everyone worth knowing, and possessed the rare and valuable gift of total recall for small social details that other people considered beneath notice. She remembered what people had worn to funerals. She remembered who had stopped speaking to whom, and approximately when, and over what variety of slight. She remembered with particular clarity anything that had struck her as not quite right, a category into which, Miss Marple was beginning to suspect, a considerable number of recent events in Steeple Markham quietly fell. "Tell me about Mr. Featherwick," said Miss Marple, accepting her second biscuit with the air of a woman making a small concession to pleasure. "What sort of man was he, Lavinia?" Mrs. Croft considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Reliable," she said at last. "Conscientious. Not imaginative, but thorough. He kept the Restoration Fund accounts for 12 years without a single irregularity. Mr. Peabody at the bank will tell you so. He was not a warm man exactly, but he was honest in the way that some people are when honesty costs them very little." "And recently?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Recently," said Mrs. Croft, setting down her cup with the particular care of someone about to say something they have been thinking for some time. "He was worried. I noticed it first perhaps 6 weeks ago. He had always been a man who walked with great purpose. You know the type, straight back, eyes forward. But I saw him twice standing at the Lich Gate in the evening, simply standing, looking up at the tower. Not going in, just looking. At what time in the evening? After evensong, which ends, as you know, at 6:30. Though lately—" Mrs. Croft paused. "Lately the bell for evensong has been ringing early, 3 or 4 minutes early. I mentioned it to Reverend Chambers, and he said he hadn't noticed. But I had. I noticed that sort of thing." "You do," agreed Miss Marple warmly. "You always did." It was on her walk back to the churchyard that afternoon, a walk Miss Marple had described to Mrs. Croft as entirely without purpose, which was not precisely true, that she found the scarf. It was caught on the iron hinge of the Lich gate, on the interior side, at a height of approximately 4 feet from the ground. A man's scarf, wool, in a dark greenish-grey, of the practical utilitarian kind sold by the better sort of country outfitter. It had not been there that morning. She was certain of this, because she had passed through the same gate at 9:30, and her eye for detail was not, whatever Inspector Cradock might privately think of elderly ladies' powers of observation, unreliable. She did not touch it. She stood at a slight distance and examined it, with the attentiveness she might have brought to an unusual plant in someone's herbaceous border. It was caught, not dropped. The wool had snagged on the iron and pulled, leaving a small but distinct ladder of loose threads on the right-hand side. Someone had passed through the gate, in a hurry, or been pulled back through it, and the scarf had caught and torn before they continued on their way. In the ordinary course of events, a person would notice this, would stop, free the scarf, inspect the damage. The fact that it had been left suggested either great haste or great agitation, or, thought Miss Marple, the possibility that the person wearing it had not passed through this gate under entirely voluntary circumstances. There was something else. The scarf had been knotted, or rather, had been in the process of being knotted because the knot was incomplete, the sort of half-finished arrangement produced when a knot is interrupted mid-tying, and the particular style of that interrupted knot was not the simple overhand knot that most people use reflexively when wrapping a scarf on a cold morning. It was the beginning of a reef knot, left over right, then right over left, the knot of a sailor, or someone who had learned their rope work in that particular tradition. Miss Marple thought of the Restoration Fund ledger. She thought of the fresh binding and the wrong handwriting. She thought of a clock running 3 minutes fast, and a verger with linseed oil hands who paused a fraction too long before answering questions about tower doors. And now she thought, who in Steeple Markham ties a reef knot? She was still considering this question when she became aware that she was not alone in the churchyard. A woman was coming along the path from the south porch, youngish, perhaps 35, wearing a well-cut dark coat and the careful, composed expression of someone who's been crying recently, and has taken considerable pains to ensure this is not visible. She carried a small bunch of bronze chrysanthemums, clearly intended for one of the graves, and she walked with the particular set of the shoulders that Miss Marple associated with people who are accustomed to being watched and have decided to behave as though they are not. She had not noticed Miss Marple, who had the considerable advantage in situations of this kind, of appearing to be simply a small, unremarkable elderly lady, examining an iron gate with vague, harmless interest. The woman passed within 10 feet of the Lich gate. Her eyes went to the scarf caught on the hinge. Her step did not falter, her expression did not change, but her left hand, which had been hanging loosely at her side, closed, briefly, involuntarily, completely, into a fist. There, thought Miss Marple with quiet and saddened certainty. That is the first person in Steeple Markham who has recognised that scarf. She watched the woman move away up the path toward the newer graves, her dark coat very upright against the grey October sky, the bronze chrysanthemums bright in her arms. Then Miss Marple looked back at the scarf, at the ladder of torn wool, at the half-finished reef knot. Someone who knew Gerald Featherwick, she thought carefully, well enough to know what he was doing in that vestry 3 times in 1 week, well enough to be frightened of what he might have found, and frightened still, because whatever he found, whatever it means, it has not gone away simply because Gerald Featherwick has. The clock tower above her began, with its customary gilded authority to strike the hour. Miss Marple counted. 4 o'clock. Her watch read 3 minutes to 4. She fastened the top button of her grey wool coat and turned toward the village, her expression thoughtful, her step unhurried, her mind moving with the quiet and steady precision of a very well-made clock, one that, unlike the tower above St. Mary the Virgin, had absolutely no reason to run fast. Chapter 4. The Lady in the Dark Coat. Her name, Mrs. Croft supplied that evening over a supper of cold ham and pickled walnuts, was Mrs. Dorothea Peel. She was the widow of Commander Rowland Peel, Royal Navy, who had died some 4 years previously of what the village understood to be a heart complaint, and she lived in a handsome Georgian house called Fern Lodge at the quieter end of Markham Lane, where she kept a small garden, employed a daily woman, and participated in village life to precisely the degree that maintained respectability without inviting intimacy. She was on the flower rota for St. Mary the Virgin. She attended the 11 o'clock service. She had contributed, Mrs. Croft noted with the particular precision she reserved for financial matters, £40 to the Restoration Fund the previous spring. "A generous sum," said Miss Marple. "Conspicuously generous," said Mrs. Croft, in a tone that suggested the distinction was not without significance. "And her relationship with Mr. Featherwick?" Mrs. Croft arranged a pickled walnut on her plate with unnecessary care. "Cordial, as one would expect between a churchwarden and a member of the congregation, though I did observe them in conversation after the September service, a rather lengthy conversation conducted in lowered voices near the vestry door, and Gerald Featherwick did not look, I thought, entirely comfortable." "And Mrs. Peel?" "Mrs. Peel," said Mrs. Croft carefully, "looked as she always looks, composed, controlled, rather as though she is perpetually sitting for a portrait and is determined it shall be a flattering one." Miss Marple said nothing and applied herself to her ham, but behind her mild blue eyes several small pieces of lacework were drawing themselves together with quiet, gathering purpose. A naval widow, a reef knot, a conspicuously generous donation to a fund whose accounts had recently been rebound in a new hand, Commander Roland Peel, Royal Navy. Miss Marple thought of a village she had once known, not St. Mary Mead, but somewhere further west, a coastal place, where a retired naval man had taught his household to tie rope the proper way, the sailor's way, because he had held that a knot tied incorrectly was a knot that would fail you when you could least afford it. His wife had learned. His children had learned. His housekeeper, after 3 years in his employ, had learned. Habits of that particular kind, in Miss Marple's experience, persisted long after the person who instilled them was gone. She called upon Mrs. Dorothea Peel the following morning. It was, on the surface, a perfectly natural visit. Miss Marple was a guest of Mrs. Croft's. Mrs. Croft and Mrs. Peel were acquainted through the flower rota, and it was entirely customary for a visitor to accompany condolence calls in the days following a parish bereavement. Miss Marple carried a small pot of Mrs. Croft's damson preserve, which served simultaneously as social currency and as an excuse for the length of the visit. Fern Lodge was precisely as she had expected, well-maintained, tastefully arranged, and possessed of the particular quality of houses in which someone lives very carefully and very alone. The drawing-room into which she was shown had good furniture, good curtains, and flowers so faultlessly arranged they seemed almost architectural. There was a writing desk near the window, closed and locked. There was a small bookcase containing volumes on garden design, naval history, and, Miss Marple noted with quiet interest, 2 books on English law, the spines well creased with consultation. Mrs. Peel received her with the composed courtesy that Mrs. Croft had described. She was handsome in the fine-drawn, self-disciplined way of women who have learned to rely entirely on themselves, and her manner combined warmth and reserve in proportions so precisely calculated that Miss Marple found herself thinking, not unkindly, of a well-built sea-wall, the surface smooth, the purpose defensive. They spoke of Mr. Featherwick. They spoke of the Restoration Fund, the forthcoming annual meeting, the shocking suddenness of unexpected loss. Mrs. Peel expressed sorrow in measured, appropriate terms. She accepted the damson preserve with genuine-seeming pleasure. She offered Miss Marple a cup of remarkably good coffee, not tea, Miss Marple noticed, the household of a naval man, and the conversation moved with the civilized, unhurried rhythm of 2 women who were each, in their separate ways, conducting a careful examination of the other. It was Miss Marple who introduced the subject of the garden. "Such a lovely aspect from this window," she said pleasantly. "And those late roses. You must give them very particular attention to have them still blooming in October." Something shifted fractionally in Mrs. Peel's composed expression. Not alarm. Something closer to relief, Miss Marple thought, as though a conversation anticipated with dread had taken an unexpectedly safe turning. "The garden is my great comfort," she said, and for the first time her voice lost its careful calibration and became simply true. "Roland always said I had a gift for it. I grow foxglove along the south wall, for the bees, principally. It self-seeds rather prolifically, I'm afraid." "Digitalis," said Miss Marple warmly. "Yes, it does spread. One must be rather careful with it, of course. In large quantities it is quite remarkably potent. She said this in precisely the tone she might use to discuss the weather, and watched Mrs. Dorothea Peel receive it. The coffee cup in Mrs. Peel's hand did not tremble. Her expression did not change, but the pause before she replied was 3 seconds longer than the remark required. "One does have to be careful," she agreed evenly. "Your husband," Miss Marple continued with gentle sympathy, "died of a heart complaint, I understand. How very distressing. Heart failure can be so sudden, can't it? One moment a person is quite well, and the next—" She shook her head with elderly sorrow. "Dr. Haydock, our village doctor in St. Mary Mead, always said that the heart is the organ most vulnerable to interference, from outside as it were." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Mrs. Peel set down her coffee cup, folded her hands in her lap with the precision of a woman placing each finger deliberately, and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that had shed, entirely and all at once, its careful social surface. Beneath it was something Miss Marple had seen before, in other faces, in other drawing-rooms. Not guilt precisely, not fear precisely. Something that combined elements of both with a third quality that Miss Marple, in the privacy of her own mind, always identified by the same word: exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has just understood, with a combination of dread and relief, that is almost indistinguishable from each other, that the carrying is nearly over. "You're not," said Mrs. Dorothea Peel very quietly, "simply a friend of Lavinia Croft's, are you?" It was not quite a question. "No," agreed Miss Marple with great gentleness, "I am afraid I'm not." Outside, in the Georgian garden of Fern Lodge, the foxgloves stood in their tall rows against the south wall, already going to seed in the October cold, their hollow stems rattling very faintly in the wind like the last, patient ticking of a clock that has almost run down. Chapter 5. The Confession by the South Wall. Mrs. Dorothea Peel did not speak immediately. She rose from her chair with the controlled, deliberate movement of a woman who has learned that dignity, once surrendered, is very difficult to recover, and she crossed to the window that looked out over the garden. She stood there for a moment with her back to Miss Marple, her shoulders very straight, her hands clasped behind her in a posture that was, Miss Marple noted with quiet recognition, almost naval in its bearing, the unconscious inheritance of a long marriage. Outside, the October garden was the colour of old brass and dark water. The foxgloves along the south wall had gone entirely to seed, their tall spires reduced to hollow rattling stems. A blackbird was working methodically through the fallen leaves beneath the rose arch, turning them with the focused, unhurried persistence of a creature that knows precisely what it is looking for. Miss Marple watched the blackbird and waited. She was, in the particular way that had disconcerted a great many people over a great many years, entirely comfortable with silence. "I did not kill Gerald Featherwick," said Mrs. Peel at last. Her voice was steady and faced the window. "I want to be clear about that before I say anything further." "I did not suppose you had," said Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Peel turned then and looked at her with an expression that contained, beneath its composure, a faint and rapidly controlled surprise. "Then what do you suppose?" "I suppose," said Miss Marple carefully setting down her coffee cup, "that Mr. Featherwick discovered something in those vestry accounts that involved you, that he came to you, perhaps privately, perhaps more than once, and that whatever passed between you, it frightened him considerably more than it frightened you, because you already knew what was in those accounts. You had known for some time." Mrs. Peel was quiet for a moment, then she returned to her chair and sat down, and when she spoke again her voice had the flat, colourless quality of someone reciting facts that have long since passed beyond the reach of emotion. "Roland died 4 years ago," she began. "The heart complaint. That part is true. He had been ill for the better part of 2 years before the end, and the medical bills were considerable. We had savings, or I believed we had savings. What I discovered, 3 months after his death, was that the savings existed largely on paper. Roland had made a series of investments in the early 50s that had failed entirely. He had concealed this from me with great thoroughness, and what I can only describe even now as misguided kindness." She paused. "I was left with this house, a modest pension, and debts amounting to just over £400. "I see," said Miss Marple, who was beginning to. "Mr. Cornelius Ratch," said Mrs. Peel, and something in the way she said the name. Precise, controlled, as one handles. Something contaminated, told Miss Marple a considerable amount before the next sentence arrived. Mr. Ratch is the Assistant Secretary of the Parish Restoration Fund. He has held the position for 6 years. He is a meticulous man, very pleasant in company, very well regarded, and he has been systematically removing small sums from the fund accounts for at least 4 of those 6 years. How small? Individually, very small. Between £15 and £50 at a time, recorded as administrative expenses, maintenance disbursements, or donations to affiliated charitable causes that do not, on investigation, appear to exist. Over 4 years, the total amounts to somewhere in the region of £380. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. And you know this because, said Mrs. Dorothea Peel with the careful precision of a woman confessing to a thing she's not proud of. He approached me 2 years ago. He knew about Roland's debts. I have never been entirely certain how, and he made me a proposition. He required someone to sign certain documentation. Authorization forms, amendment requests, a small number of correspondence items that would support the fiction of the non-existent charitable organizations. In exchange, he would ensure that my name appeared on a legacy document relating to a minor fund disbursement, which would resolve my most pressing financial difficulties. She looked directly at Miss Marple. I was to use the plain word blackmailed, and I complied. For 18 months I complied, and in doing so I made myself entirely, comprehensively culpable. The handwriting in the new ledger, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. Mine, confirmed Mrs. Peel without flinching. Ratch had the original volume rebound to remove 3 pages that contained a discrepancy too large to be explained away. The replacement pages were written in my hand because his own hand appeared too frequently elsewhere in the records, and he required a second signature to suggest independent verification. Gerald Featherwick, when he began his pre-meeting review of the accounts, recognised that the handwriting on those pages was not consistent with previous entries. He came to you, twice. The first time he was uncertain. He wanted an explanation, something that would allow him to be satisfied. He was not at heart a man who wished to find trouble. She paused. The second time he came, he had found the discrepancy in the affiliated organisations. He knew. And after the second visit? Mrs. Peel's hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 days later, he was dead. The word settled into the room's quiet like a stone into still water. You believe Ratch killed him, said Miss Marple. I believe, said Mrs. Peel with the slow, exhausted certainty of someone who has rehearsed this conclusion, in the dark hours of many successive nights, that Gerald Featherwick did not fall down that staircase, by accident. He was a careful man, a deliberate man, a man who had climbed those stairs 100 times. And I believe that Cornelius Ratch, who serves on the Clock Tower Maintenance Committee, and therefore has a key to the tower at all hours, knew that Gerald Featherwick had a habit of going up to the tower in the early morning to check the clock mechanism, because Featherwick had mentioned it at a committee meeting not 6 weeks before. She looked at Miss Marple steadily. I cannot prove any of this. If I go to Inspector Cradock, I implicate myself entirely, and Ratch will simply deny everything. The rebound ledger will be explained, my handwriting will condemn me, and Ratch, who is considerably cleverer than he appears and has had considerably more time to prepare, will emerge as a wronged man. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. That is rather the difficulty, isn't it? She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden, at the hollow foxglove stems and the methodical blackbird at the south wall with its patient seeding cargo of digitalis. Tell me about Mr. Ratch, she said at last. Not his position or his history. Tell me the small things, his habits, what he eats, what he wears, how he ties his scarf. Mrs. Peel blinked very slightly. It was not the question she had expected. He is punctual to a fault, she said slowly. He walks everywhere, never takes the bus. He has his hair cut on the first Monday of every month at Briggs in the High Street. He drinks his tea without sugar. He always wears the same grey-green wool scarf from October to March. His sister knitted it for him, I believe, and he ties it. She stopped. Her eyes met Miss Marple's. In a reef knot, said Miss Marple very gently. The clock on Mrs. Peel's mantelpiece ticked on in the silence. Outside, the blackbird found what it had been looking for, and flew away with it into the grey October sky. Chapter 6. The Habits of Mr. Ratch. Cornelius Ratch lived in a narrow, well-kept terraced house on Vesper Street, 3 minutes' walk from the church and 5 from the High Street, in a position that afforded him, Miss Marple reflected as she passed it at a measured stroll the following morning, an excellent view of the comings and goings of approximately 2/3 of the village. The house was called, with a smallness of imagination that Miss Marple found faintly revealing, number 14. No name, no flourish, simply the number, painted in precise black letters on a white board beside a door that was painted the particular shade of dark green, favoured by men who consider themselves practical. The curtains were good quality and always drawn to exactly the same depth. The step was scrubbed. The small front garden contained no flowers, only a clipped box hedge, geometrically maintained, and a single standard rose that had been pruned back so severely it looked less like a garden plant than a problem that had been firmly dealt with. Miss Marple walked past it twice, at different hours, with the unhurried purposefulness of a woman engaged in wholesome exercise, and noted the following: that the downstairs lights came on at 7:15 precisely. That Mr. Ratch left the house each morning at 8:45, turned left toward the High Street, and walked with the brisk metronomic step of a man for whom a walk is a scheduled event rather than a pleasure, and that he wore, as Mrs. Peel had described, the grey-green wool scarf, a new one now, she observed, or at least a replacement, the knot at the front tied with the neat, practised efficiency of long habit, a reef knot, left over right, right over left, pulled firm. She also noted on her second pass a detail that she found considerably more interesting than the scarf. In the narrow side passage between number 14 and its neighbour, barely visible from the street, there stood 3 large glass jars of the sort used for preserving. They were sealed, and their contents, visible as a dark granular matter, were not. Miss Marple was reasonably confident jam. She mentioned none of this to Inspector Craddock, with whom she had a brief and not entirely satisfactory conversation outside the post office on Thursday morning. The inspector was a man of genuine goodwill and genuine limitations, and the combination, in Miss Marple's experience, required careful handling. "Dreadful business about poor Featherwick," she said, falling into step beside him with the harmless persistence of a woman who has nothing particular to do. "I understand you've concluded it was accidental." "Worn steps, elderly gentleman, early morning," said the inspector with the comfortable brevity of a man whose file is closed. "Tragic, but not uncommon." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "though I wonder, did your examination of the tower establish when Mr. Featherwick had last wound the clock mechanism? I only asked because I noticed the clock has been running slightly fast, and I thought perhaps in his anxiety to correct it, he might have been in more of a hurry than usual on the stairs." Inspector Craddock looked at her with the expression of a man who has been asked a question he considers eccentric by a person he considers negligible, and who is too well-mannered to say so directly. "The clock mechanism wasn't examined in detail, no reason to." "Of course," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And the tower door, I believe it was found ajar?" "Old latch doesn't always catch. The Verger confirmed it." "Yes, Mr. Toop, such a dedicated man. Though I did wonder, the Tower Maintenance Committee holds keys, I believe? A sensible precaution having several key holders. Standard arrangement for a building of that age." "Quite so. And Mr. Ratch, as Assistant Secretary, he would be on that committee, I imagine." The inspector stopped walking and looked at her with an attention that was, for the first time, not entirely dismissive. I'm sorry, I've forgotten." "Marple," she supplied pleasantly. "Miss Marple, is there something specific you're suggesting?" Miss Marple looked at him with her clearest, most guileless expression. "I am an old woman who notices small things," she said. "I leave the suggesting entirely to those better qualified. I only thought the clock mechanism might be worth a look, for completeness." She left him on the pavement with the slightly unsettled expression of a man who cannot quite determine whether he has been helped or managed, and continued on her way to Briggs's barber shop in the High Street. Mr. Briggs was a small, companionable man who had been cutting the hair of Steeple Markham's male population for 30 years, and had, in that time, accumulated a quantity of village knowledge that would have been invaluable to any serious investigator, and was entirely wasted on a man whose primary interest was football. He confirmed, without requiring any particular encouragement, that Mr. Cornelius Ratch came in on the first Monday of every month, that he had done so for 11 years without exception, that he always had the same thing, short back and sides, nothing off the top, and that he was, in Mr. Briggs' considered professional opinion, a very precise sort of gentleman, particular-like, doesn't care for surprises. "No," agreed Miss Marple, I imagine he doesn't. Funny thing, though, said Mr. Briggs, with the ruminative air of a man producing an afterthought that is not entirely an afterthought. He was in on a Wednesday last week, not his usual Monday. First time in 11 years he'd come in off schedule, seemed, I don't know, not himself. When on Wednesday, Mr. Briggs considered. Morning, 11ish, day after they found poor Mr. Featherwick. Miss Marple thanked him warmly, declined the offer of a cup of tea from the back room, and stepped back out into the high street where the October wind was moving the last of the leaves along the pavement in small, urgent eddies. A precise man, off his schedule, the morning after a death he had arranged. Agitation. The need for the ordinary, the habitual, the controlled. The barber's chair as a form of reassurance. The confirmation that routine still held, that the world still ran according to plan. She thought of the glass jars in the side passage. She thought of the vestry cash box and the rebound ledger. She thought of a clock wound deliberately fast and a staircase climbed in the dark of an October morning by a man who believed he was alone. And she thought of something else now, something that had been sitting quietly at the edge of her attention since her conversation with Mrs. Peel, waiting with the patient, unfussy persistence of a fact that knows its moment will come. Commander Roland Peel had died of a heart complaint. He had been ill for 2 years. He had been, during those 2 years, in the care of a village doctor, not Dr. Haydock, who was St. Mary Mead's own, but a Dr. Prentice of Markham, who had retired 18 months ago and moved to the coast. And Cornelius Ratch, this she had established from Mrs. Croft's inexhaustible archive of village memory over supper the previous evening, had been, in the years before Roland Peel's illness, a frequent visitor to Fern Lodge. A friend of the commander's, it was understood. They had served in the same theatre during the war, though in different capacities. They had remained until approximately 2 years into the commander's illness on cordial terms. And then, for reasons that Mrs. Croft could not precisely specify, but which she had noticed with the accuracy she brought to all social discontinuities, the visits had stopped. Completely. Miss Marple stood on the high street pavement and looked at nothing in particular with the expression that those who knew her well, her nephew Raymond, her friend Dolly Bantry, would have recognised immediately. She was not looking at nothing. She was looking at everything all at once, and it was assembling itself with the quiet, inevitable logic of a completed pattern. The 3 glass jars in the side passage of number 14, a naval friendship that had ended without explanation, a heart that had failed, perhaps, with assistance, and a woman on the flower rota who had known for 2 years exactly what she was living beside. Miss Marple turned and walked, with great purpose and no apparent hurry, back toward Mrs. Croft's cottage. She had a letter to write, not to Inspector Craddock, to Dr. Prentice, retired, on the coast. Chapter 7. The Letter to the Coast. Miss Marple wrote letters the way she did most things, with complete attention, considerable care, and a deceptive simplicity of surface that concealed, beneath its pleasant conversational tone, a precision of purpose that would have surprised anyone who had not read one before. She sat at the small writing desk in the guest bedroom of Mrs. Croft's cottage, a desk that smelled of lavender polish and had a slightly uneven surface that caused her pen to catch on the upstroke, which she compensated for with the automatic adjustment of long practice. And she wrote to Dr. Archibald Prentice of Saltmere-on-Sea, in the unhurried hand of a woman composing a friendly inquiry. She did not mention murder. She did not mention fraud or blackmail or a clock wound deliberately fast. She wrote instead about a mutual acquaintance, a fiction but a plausible one, and the acquaintance's concern about a family medical history specifically relating to cardiac episodes in men of Commander Peel's generation and background. She wrote warmly of Steeple Markham's charm. She mentioned, as a pleasant aside, that she had recently met Mrs. Dorothea Peel, such a composed and admirable woman, still managing so well after the sad loss of her husband. She noted that Commander Peel's illness had been, she understood, rather a prolonged one, and that the final episode had been. Here she chose her words with the care of a woman selecting the right size of needle for a particular stitch, perhaps unexpectedly swift given the chronic nature of the condition. She asked, with the guileless curiosity of the genuinely interested, whether Dr. Prentice had found, in his experience, that such sudden conclusions to long illnesses were common, or whether they sometimes warranted, in retrospect, a closer examination than the circumstances at the time had permitted. She read it through twice, made one small alteration, changing closer examination to more thorough consideration, which was gentler and therefore more likely to produce a candid reply, and sealed it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has said precisely what she intended, and not one word more. She posted it herself at the post office on the High Street at 9:30 on Thursday morning. Then she went to call on the Reverend Gerald Chambers. The vicarage sat behind a yew hedge of impressive antiquity, its garden the comfortable, slightly overgrown sort that suggested a man more interested in his parishioners than his herbaceous borders. Reverend Chambers was a tall, mild-eyed man of 60, with the slight stoop of someone who has spent decades bending attentively toward people shorter than himself, and he received Miss Marple in his study with the unaffected warmth of a man who genuinely enjoyed conversation, and had no idea that the conversation he was about to have was not entirely what it appeared. The study was a good room, books to the ceiling, a fire that actually drew, a desk buried under correspondence, and on the corner, half beneath a copy of the Church Quarterly, a framed photograph that Miss Marple noted with quiet interest the moment she sat down. It showed 4 men in naval uniform, young, squinting into sunlight. On the back, visible because the frame was slightly too small and the photograph curled at one corner, was written in faded pencil, Alexandria, 1943. Peel, Ratch, Hartley, Chambers. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the outward serenity of a woman admiring a pleasant room, and filed it in the place where she kept things that changed the shape of everything. Chambers. The vicar of St. Mary the Virgin had served in the same theatre as Rowland Peel and Cornelius Ratch. They had not been acquaintances brought together by village geography. They had been, 40 years ago in Alexandria, something considerably closer than that. "You knew Commander Peel well," she said pleasantly when the tea had been poured. It was not quite a question. Reverend Chambers looked at the photograph with an expression of unguarded fondness that told her a great deal. "Rowland?" "Yes, since 42. We went through a considerable amount together, the 4 of us. The way you do, in wartime, you become, not friends exactly, something more specific than that. And Mr. Ratch was part of that group. Neil, yes." A slight shift in tone, not quite discomfort, but the verbal equivalent of a chair moved an inch. "We've remained in contact, in the way one does. Village life rather maintained it for us, in Ratch and my case." "You must have been glad of that continuity," said Miss Marple, "and troubled, I imagine, by Rowland's illness. To watch a man you'd known since 42 decline over such a long period." "Very troubled," said the vicar quietly. And then, with the honesty of a man whose vocation had trained him to recognise evasion in himself, "More troubled in some ways at the end than I had expected to be." Miss Marple set down her cup. "In what way?" The Reverend Chambers looked at the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful, reluctant quality of a man approaching a door he has kept closed for 4 years and is not entirely certain he should open. Rowland was ill, yes. His heart was compromised. That was genuine and documented. But in the last month before he died, he had been improving. Dr. Prentice had mentioned it cautiously. A stabilization. Not a recovery, but a plateau. Rowland himself had seemed lighter, more himself. He paused. And then, very suddenly, he was gone. "Did you speak to Dr. Prentice about your concerns?" "I mentioned them, obliquely. Prentice was a careful man, and the death was not without medical explanation. The heart was compromised. A final episode was always possible. There was nothing that compelled a formal question." He looked at his hands. "And I told myself that grief makes people look for patterns, makes them want a reason more dramatic than simple illness." "But you did not entirely believe that," said Miss Marple gently. The vicar was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said at last, "I did not entirely believe that. And since Mr. Featherwick's death?" The question arrived softly, but it arrived with the full weight of everything that had preceded it, and Reverend Chambers received it like a man who has been expecting a particular letter for a very long time and has just heard it come through the door. He moved to the window, and stood looking out at the yew hedge with his hands clasped behind him, in a posture that reminded Miss Marple, with a small sad accuracy, of Mrs. Dorothea Peel standing at her garden window 3 days before. "Gerald came to me," he said without turning, 10 days before he died. He had found something in the accounts. He would not tell me the full detail, only that it was serious and that it involved someone he had trusted. He asked me whether I thought there were circumstances in which a man might be justified in concealing a wrongdoing to protect others from a greater harm. What did you tell him? I told him what a vicar must tell him, that concealment of wrongdoing is rarely as protective as it appears, and that the truth, however painful, is generally the only foundation on which anything sound can be built. He paused. He thanked me and left. I've thought about that conversation every day since they found him. Miss Marple looked at the framed photograph on the desk. 4 young men in Alexandria, 1943. Peel, Ratch, Hartley, Chambers. Hartley, she said quietly. Who was Hartley? The Reverend Chambers turned from the window, and his expression, for just a moment before he controlled it, was that of a man who has heard a name he hoped would not be spoken. Thomas Hartley, he said carefully, died in 44, in the field. I see, said Miss Marple, but she was thinking 4 names on the photograph. 2 dead. 1 compromised and frightened, and 1 precise, habitual, dangerous, living 3 minutes' walk from the church, with glass jars in his side passage and a brand new grey-green scarf tied in a reef knot. She took her leave of the vicar with great warmth and every appearance of having had a thoroughly pleasant morning call. Walking back through the village, she turned the photograph over in her mind, examining its edges. Dr. Prentice's reply she estimated would arrive by Saturday. She wondered, with the quiet urgency of a woman who has learned not to ignore such things, whether Saturday would be soon enough. Chapter 8. The reply from Saltmere. The letter arrived on Saturday morning, as Miss Marple had anticipated, delivered with the second post at 11 o'clock by a cheerful young postman who accepted Mrs. Croft's offer of a biscuit with the unself-conscious gratitude of someone for whom biscuits are always welcome regardless of circumstance. Miss Marple was in the sitting-room with her knitting when Mrs. Croft brought it through. She had been working on a pale blue cardigan intended for her great-niece in Cheltenham, and she had reached the point in the pattern, the shaping of the left shoulder, that required the particular quality of attention that looks, from the outside, entirely like peaceful inactivity. She set the knitting down, accepted the letter, and opened it with the letter knife from Mrs. Croft's writing table. Dr. Archibald Prentice wrote a good letter. This was her first observation, and not an irrelevant one. A man who writes a good letter thinks carefully before committing himself, weighs his words, and understands that what is written down has a different quality of permanence from what is merely said. He had understood, she was certain, the precise nature of her inquiry. He had understood it, and he had chosen, after what she estimated had been a considerable period of reflection, to answer it honestly. He began with the pleasantries appropriate to a letter from a retired professional to an unknown elderly lady, and Miss Marple moved through these with the practised patience of a woman who knows that the substance of a letter is always in its second half. She was correct. "I have thought carefully about your inquiry," Dr. Prentice wrote, "and about the delicacy of what I am about to say. I wish to be clear that the death certificate I completed for Commander Roland Peel was completed in good conscience and on the basis of the medical evidence available to me at the time. His cardiac condition was genuine, well documented, and entirely consistent with the final episode. However," Miss Marple's attention, already considerable, sharpened further at that single word sitting in its own line like a man clearing his throat before a confession. "In the weeks following Commander Peel's death, I was approached by a colleague, a specialist in clinical toxicology at the county hospital, whom I had consulted informally on 1 or 2 previous occasions, who raised, entirely unprompted, and on the basis of a conversation about general practice, the question of digitalis toxicity in patients with pre-existing cardiac compromise. He noted that the presentation of acute digitalis poisoning in such patients is, in the majority of cases, clinically indistinguishable from natural cardiac failure, and that without specific toxicological screening, which is not routinely performed in cases where natural death is anticipated, it would not ordinarily be identified. I am not stating that Commander Peel was poisoned. I am stating that after this conversation I found myself returning on several occasions to the final weeks of his illness with a degree of unease that I was not able to entirely rationalise away. He had been stabilising, his spirits had improved. The final episode was rapid to a degree that I had not, in honesty, anticipated. I did not act on this unease. I have asked myself many times since whether I should have done. The answer I arrive at in my more candid moments is yes. If there is now reason to believe that the circumstances of Commander Peel's death warrant formal re-examination, I would not oppose such a re-examination, and would cooperate fully with any properly constituted inquiry. I trust the matter is in capable hands." Miss Marple read this through twice, folded it with great care, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on it in her lap, and her eyes on the middle distance, where nothing particular was happening. Digitalis, the foxgloves along Mrs. Peel's south wall. Self-seeding prolifically. One must be careful, in large quantities quite remarkably potent. And Cornelius Ratch, a frequent visitor to Fern Lodge, in the years before Roland Peel's decline, a man who would have known the garden as well as he knew anything, the position of the plants, the habit of the household, the particular tea that was always served at 4 o'clock. The glass jars in the side passage of number 14. She rose, placed Dr. Prentice's letter in the inside pocket of her grey wool coat with the deliberate care of someone securing a document they intend to produce at a specific moment, and went to find Mrs. Croft. "Lavinia," she said, from the sitting-room doorway, "does Mr. Ratch have any remaining connection to Fern Lodge? Any reason to visit Mrs. Peel?" Mrs. Croft looked up from her correspondence with the expression of a woman who has been asked a question that connects, unexpectedly, to something she has been quietly wondering about herself. "Not that I know of. They haven't been on visiting terms for years, though—" She paused with the particular hesitation of someone retrieving a small specific memory. Doris mentioned, our Doris, the housemaid, that she'd seen a man at Mrs. Peel's gate on Thursday evening, after dark. She didn't recognise him, but she described a grey-green scarf. Miss Marple was very still for a moment. "What time on Thursday?" She said just after 7. She was closing the blackout. Force of habit, she still does it, even all these years on, and she saw him from the upstairs window. Thursday evening. The day after Miss Marple had called on Mrs. Peel. The day after Mrs. Peel had, in the drawing-room of Fern Lodge, allowed her composure to slip sufficiently to confirm what she knew about Cornelius Ratch. Ratch was watching, or had been told, by someone, that questions were being asked. Miss Marple thought of the vicar's study, the wartime photograph, the 40-year connection. She thought of Reverend Chambers standing at his window with his hands clasped behind him, and she thought of a mild-eyed man who had spent decades being honest with his parishioners, and had, 4 years ago, failed to be honest with himself. She did not think he had told Ratch deliberately. She thought it considerably more likely that a man carrying guilt of that particular weight, the guilt of suspected knowledge set aside, might, in conversation with an old wartime companion, have let something show. A discomfort. A question. Enough. She put on her coat, buttoned it to the collar, and picked up her knitting bag. "I am going to call on Inspector Cradock," she told Mrs. Croft, with the pleasant serenity of a woman announcing a minor errand. Mrs. Croft looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent 10 days observing a houseguest's minor errands, and has arrived at a considered opinion of their nature. "Shall I keep supper warm?" "That would be very kind," said Miss Marple, "though I may be a little while." She paused at the door. "Lavinia, would you send word to Mrs. Peel? Quietly, not by telephone. Ask Doris to go directly, on foot. Tell Mrs. Peel that she should not admit anyone to the house this evening. Anyone at all, regardless of how familiar they may be to her." Mrs. Croft, to her considerable credit, did not ask why. She simply nodded, with the gravity of a woman who has understood, finally and fully, that what has been happening in Steeple Markham this October is not a matter of unfortunate accidents. "And the message from you," she said, "in case Mrs. Peel asks who has sent it." Miss Marple considered for a brief moment. "Tell her," she said quietly, "that the foxgloves are not the only thing in her garden that has been allowed to seed too freely. She will understand." She walked out into the pale October morning, Dr. Prentice's letter in her pocket and the whole assembled pattern of it clear and complete in her mind, moving with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a woman who has turned over the last piece of the puzzle and found that it fits precisely where she expected it to. Above the rooftops of Steeple Markham, the 4 gilded faces of St. Mary the Virgin glinted in the thin autumn light, still running, as they had run all week, 3 minutes fast. Not for much longer, thought Miss Marple. Not for much longer now. Chapter 9. The Inspector's Education. Inspector Craddock's office at the Markham Constabulary was a room that reflected its occupant with the unintentional honesty of all working spaces. Tidy in its broad arrangement, cluttered in its particulars, and possessed of a filing system that suggested a man who believed in order as a principle while struggling with it as a practice. There was a calendar on the wall showing the correct month, but the wrong week. There was a photograph of a rugby team on the shelf behind his chair, several of its members unidentifiable beneath mud. There was on the corner of his desk a cup of tea that had been made some time ago and forgotten, and which had reached that melancholy stage of tepidity that no amount of subsequent goodwill could redeem. Miss Marple sat across from him in the visitor's chair, a hard, practical thing that had clearly been selected without any particular concern for the comfort of visitors, and placed Dr. Prentice's letter on the desk between them with the quiet decisiveness of a woman playing a card she has been holding for precisely the right moment. The inspector read it. He read it with the focused, effortful attention of a man who is being asked to revise a conclusion he has already filed, which is, in Miss Marple's experience, among the more demanding things one can ask of an official. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her. "This is a retired GP expressing retrospective unease," he said carefully. "It isn't evidence." "No," agreed Miss Marple pleasantly. "It is, however, the beginning of evidence, in the same way that a single dropped stitch is not a ruined garment, but is very often the beginning of one, if it isn't caught in time." Inspector Craddock looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been compared, implicitly, to a dropped stitch, and is uncertain how to respond to this. "What I am suggesting," Miss Marple continued in the gentle, inexorable tone of a woman who has navigated a great many Inspector Craddocks over a great many years, "is that 4 things, taken individually, may each be explained away. A retired doctor's unease about a death 4 years ago, a parish ledger rebound in an unfamiliar hand, a churchwarden found dead at the foot of a staircase he had climbed 100 times, and a clock running consistently 3 minutes fast in a tower to which Mr. Cornelius Ratch holds a key." She paused. Taken together, however, they describe something rather different from a series of unfortunate coincidences. "Ratch," said the inspector slowly. "You're suggesting Ratch." "I am suggesting that Mr. Ratch's connection to the tower, his position as Assistant Secretary of the Restoration Fund, his wartime acquaintance with Commander Peel, and his presence at Mrs. Peel's gate on Thursday evening, after dark, warrant, at the very minimum, a conversation." "His presence at Mrs. Peel's?" The inspector frowned. "How do you know about that?" A reliable witness observed him from an upstairs window. The grey-green scarf is distinctive. She met his eyes with the mild steadiness that she knew, from long experience, was considerably more difficult to dismiss than agitation or insistence. "Inspector, I would also suggest that the glass jars currently stored in the side passage of number 14 Vesper Street merit prompt professional attention, before Mr. Ratch has further opportunity to deal with their contents." There was a silence. "Glass jars," said Inspector Craddock. 3 of them. Large, sealed, dark granular contents, stored in the side passage rather than inside the house, which suggests either that they are not considered safe for indoor storage, or that they are intended for disposal in the near future. The inspector looked at Dr. Prentice's letter. He looked at Miss Marple. He looked at the cold tea on his desk with the expression of a man who wishes suddenly and acutely that it was something considerably stronger. "If I approach Ratch on the basis of this and there's nothing in those jars but, I don't know, preserved fruit, then," said Miss Marple serenely, "you have had a conversation with a member of the Parish Maintenance Committee about his storage arrangements, which is entirely within the scope of normal community relations, but I do not think they contain preserved fruit." She left him 20 minutes later with Dr. Prentice's letter. She had brought a copy, prepared that morning in her neat, careful hand, and with the names of Mrs. Peel, Mr. Toop, and Reverend Chambers, each annotated with a single sentence indicating what each knew and what each was prepared to confirm. She had constructed this document at Mrs. Croft's writing desk before leaving the cottage, with the same methodical clarity she brought to a complicated knitting pattern. Every step in sequence, every dependency noted, nothing assumed that had not been established. It was, she reflected, walking back through the village in the thin October afternoon, the part of these matters she found most demanding. Not the observation, that was simply attention, which had always come naturally to her. Not the reasoning, that was pattern recognition, which was a form of housekeeping she had practiced her entire life. The demanding part was the handing over, the moment at which the thing she'd assembled with such care was placed in the hands of someone else, someone with the institutional authority to act on it, and she was required to trust that they would. Inspector Craddock was not, she acknowledged to herself, Inspector Slack. He was not brilliant, but he was not corrupt, and he was not the kind of man who would ignore a named suspect, a specific address, and a retired doctor's letter simply because the information had been delivered by a small, elderly woman in a grey wool coat. He would act. He would act with the careful, slightly laborious thoroughness of a man who knew he had missed something once and did not wish to miss it again. She was passing the Lich gate of St. Mary the Virgin when she heard quick footsteps behind her on the path. She did not quicken her pace. She turned, with the unhurried composure of a woman expecting nothing alarming, and found herself looking at Cornelius Ratch. He was not wearing the grey-green scarf. He wore a dark overcoat, and his face had the pale, controlled tautness of a man who has been managing a growing alarm for several days, and has reached the point where management is no longer sufficient. His eyes were the pale grey of a winter sky before snow, and they assessed her with an intelligence that was, she noted, considerably sharper than his carefully maintained village persona suggested. "Miss Marple," he said. His voice was pleasant, even conversational. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced. I'm Cornelius Ratch." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I know. I understand you've been asking questions about parish matters." He smiled, and the smile was the kind that contains no warmth whatsoever. "It's a great kindness, your concern for the village, but I wonder if you're perhaps reading more into things than is quite there. The imagination can be very active in quiet places, particularly for those unaccustomed to country life." Miss Marple looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments of this particular kind, the expression of a woman who is genuinely unfrightened, and who knows that genuine unfrightfulness is the one response for which a man like Cornelius Ratch has made no preparation. "What a very interesting thing to say," she said pleasantly. "Do you know, in my experience, it is almost always the person who cautions others against reading too much into things who has the strongest reason for hoping that nothing further is read at all." Ratch was still for a moment. The pale, grey eyes held hers with the flat, assessing calculation of a man running rapid alternatives. "You're a long way from home, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed, with perfect serenity. "But then, evil is never purely local, Mr. Ratch. That is rather the point about it. It travels. It settles wherever the conditions allow." She tilted her head with the mild attentiveness of a woman who has just thought of something interesting, rather like foxglove seed when you think about it. The stillness that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Ratch turned and walked away, back up the path toward the village, his pace precisely controlled, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders carrying the rigid composure of a man who knows he has just lost something irretrievable and has not yet decided what to do about it. Miss Marple watched him go. Then she turned, passed through the Lich gate, and walked back to Mrs. Croft's cottage for supper, which was keeping warm on the stove, and which smelled, most promisingly, of lamb and rosemary. She estimated, given Inspector Craddock quite enough to be going on with. Chapter 10. The Clock Set Right. They found the glass jars on Sunday morning. Inspector Craddock, to his considerable credit, had moved with a promptness that Miss Marple had not entirely anticipated, and was prepared to acknowledge. He had applied for and received the necessary authority on Saturday evening, had presented himself at No. 14 Vesper Street at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, with 2 constables and the careful, slightly embarrassed formality of a man who is doing something he hopes will prove necessary, and had found the side passage of the house precisely as Miss Marple had described it. The 3 glass jars contained, as she had suspected, a preparation derived from Digitalis purpurea, foxglove, in its concentrated, methodically reduced form, processed with a patience and a knowledge of plant chemistry that spoke of considerable prior research and, the county forensic officer would later confirm, prior practice. The concentration was, in the forensic officer's measured professional language, sufficient to cause fatal cardiac arrhythmia in a healthy adult and near certain cardiac arrest in a subject with pre-existing heart disease. The county forensic officer was a precise man who chose his words carefully. Cornelius Ratch was not at No. 14 when the inspector arrived. He had left, his neighbour confirmed, at approximately 6:30 that morning, carrying a single bag. He had taken the 7 o'clock bus to Milchester, and from Milchester, this established by a ticket clerk with an excellent memory for regulars who were not behaving regularly, he had purchased a single ticket to London Waterloo. He was apprehended at Waterloo Station at 11:45 on Sunday morning by 2 officers of the Metropolitan Police acting on Inspector Craddock's telephoned communication, standing at the departures board with the stillness of a man who has run his calculations and arrived at a number he does not like, and is considering, with the focused practicality of a naturally methodical person, what to do next. He did not resist. He was, according to the arresting officer's subsequent report, entirely composed. He asked, with the polite precision that had characterized him throughout, whether he might retrieve a book from his bag for the journey. The request was declined. Miss Marple heard the news from Inspector Craddock himself, who came to Mrs. Croft's cottage on Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man rehearsing an acknowledgment he is not entirely accustomed to making. "The jars," he said, accepting a cup of tea and sitting in the armchair that Mrs. Croft indicated with the air of a woman who believes that bad news is always better received in a comfortable seat. "You were right about the jars. And the clock mechanism. We had the tower examined this morning. The regulating weight had been deliberately adjusted. Someone who knew the mechanism had moved it to, caused the clock to run approximately 3 minutes fast. Consistently," said Miss Marple, "consistently. It would have taken someone with both access and knowledge of the mechanism, which the maintenance committee members have, as you pointed out. The purpose," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "would have been to establish a false timeline. If Mr. Featherwick's death occurred at, shall we say, 7:25 by the clock, which was in fact 7:22 by actual time, and if Mr. Ratch could establish his presence somewhere else at 7:20, the 3 minutes would provide a margin of alibi that a fast clock would support and a correct clock would not." Inspector Craddock looked at her with the expression of a man reviewing, silently and somewhat painfully, the speed with which he had closed his original file. "It's a very narrow margin." "Precise men work with narrow margins," said Miss Marple. "They find them more reliable." There was a pause during which the inspector drank his tea and Mrs. Croft, with great tact, found something to attend to in the kitchen. "Commander Peel," said Miss Marple quietly, "will that be re-examined?" "Dr. Prentice has been contacted. He's prepared to provide a full statement. Whether a formal exhumation—" The inspector paused. "That will depend on what Ratch chooses to say, and when. But yes, it will be re-examined." "Good," said Miss Marple simply. She looked out of the sitting-room window at the October garden, where the last leaves were coming down in the still afternoon air, with the unhurried, inevitable patience of things that have been waiting for their proper time. "Mrs. Peel," she said. "She will need to make a full statement regarding the ledger entries. She knows this. I spoke to her this morning. She is prepared. Her solicitor has been contacted." He hesitated. "Given the circumstances of the coercion and her cooperation, I imagine the court will take a considered view." "I hope it will," said Miss Marple. "She's not a guilty woman in the way that matters most. She's a frightened one who made a wrong choice and has been paying for it every day since. That is a different thing, though the law does not always distinguish between them as carefully as one might wish." The inspector left at 4 o'clock, taking his hat and his slightly chastened expression, and the copy of Dr. Prentice's letter, which Miss Marple no longer required. On Monday morning, the day before her fortnight was complete, and her return to St. Mary Mead arranged, Miss Marple walked to the church of St. Mary the Virgin for the last time. The morning was clear and cold, the sky that particular shade of pale blue that October produces only at its best, and the churchyard lay quiet under it with the settled, ancient patience of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human trouble over a great many centuries and has not been fundamentally altered by any of it. She stood at the Lich gate for a moment, her knitting bag over her arm, her grey coat buttoned to the collar, and looked up at the 4 gilded faces of the clock tower. The clock read 8:53. Her watch, the small reliable silver one from Raymond, read 8:53. The tower clock had been corrected on Sunday afternoon, at Inspector Craddock's instruction, by the sexton who understood the mechanism. It was running correctly for the first time in, she estimated, based on the gradual, deliberate nature of the adjustment, at least 6 weeks, perhaps longer. It seemed to her, standing in the pale October light, a thing of disproportionate satisfaction. Not the arrest, not the letter, not the careful assembly of evidence that had moved the matter from a closed file to an open inquiry, though all of those were necessary and right. But this, the simple, quiet fact of a clock running correctly, telling the right time, refusing now to deceive. She went inside for the 8 o'clock service, which she had missed. It was after all 8:53. But sat for a time in the cool, stone-floored quiet of the nave, where the autumn light came through the east window in long, pale bars, and the smell of old wood and candle wax and centuries of accumulated prayer lay over everything like a kind of permanence. Reverend Chambers conducted the 9 o'clock with his usual mildness and his usual slight stoop, and if his voice carried an additional quality of subdued weight that morning, a seriousness beneath the familiar words, Miss Marple thought it was not unfitting. He was a man who had much to think about, and she believed the honesty to think about it properly. That was not nothing. Mr. Toop, she noted, was absent. He had been interviewed by Inspector Craddock on Saturday afternoon and had confirmed, with the relieved thoroughness of a man who has been frightened into silence and is grateful to be released from it, that Ratch had asked him to leave the tower door ajar on the morning of Featherwick's death, on the pretext of a maintenance inspection. He had not known what he was facilitating. Miss Marple was inclined to believe him, and not only because believing him was more comfortable. She believed him because of the linseed oil and the careful darning on his cuff and the waterish eyes of a man who worried in the small hours. Guilty men do not generally smell of linseed and worry about their cuffs. They have larger concerns. After the service she lit a candle at the small side chapel, not for anyone in particular, or perhaps for everyone in particular, and walked back through the churchyard in the clear October morning. At the Lich gate she paused, as she had paused so many times in the past fortnight, and looked back at the tower. 8:53 had become 9:41, and the clock said so, truthfully and without equivocation. Human nature, Miss Marple said quietly, to no one in particular, is, as I have always maintained, remarkably consistent. People do, in the end, what their natures prepare them to do. The difficult thing is not predicting it. The difficult thing is accepting it when it arrives. She passed through the Lich gate and walked back through Steeple Markham one last time, past the post office and Briggs' barber shop, and the narrow front of number 14 with its clipped box hedge and its empty side passage, through the village that had been, for a fortnight, the whole particular world of this particular mystery, and which would go on being itself, its hedgerows, its chrysanthemums, its gilded clock, its imperfect and striving and occasionally terrible human inhabitants, long after she had returned to St. Mary Mead and the comfortable resumed rhythms of her own small life. Mrs. Croft had kedgeree for breakfast and the fire lit in the sitting-room, and she asked no questions, which was the greatest kindness she could have offered. Miss Marple ate her kedgeree, picked up her knitting, and found her place in the pattern, the left shoulder, where she had paused 8 days ago, and continued. And so, dear friends, the clock of St. Mary the Virgin tells the right time once more, and Steeple Markham settles back into the quiet rhythms of an English autumn, a little wiser, a little sadder, and perhaps a little more inclined to look carefully at the small things that others pass by without a second glance. That, I think, is what Miss Marple gives us most of all. Not just the solution to the mystery, but the reminder that attention, quiet, patient, unhurried attention, is among the most powerful things a person can bring to the world. I hope tonight's story has given you a little of that peace, dear friends, wherever in this wide world you are listening from. If it has, I'd love to know in the comments, and to please tell me, is there a small detail in your own daily life that you notice, that others seem to walk past entirely? I always love to read what you share. Don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community keeps growing, and a new story finds you every single day. Until next time, good night, sleep well, and keep your eyes open for the small things. They are almost always the ones that matter most.